All right. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone who took the time this morning to attend today's webinar on making MTSS happen, realistic implementation at the secondary level. I know from my own experiences as well as travels around the state that MTSS is a challenge at middle and high school levels. And this morning we have almost 200 people registered. If you need to step away, don't worry. Everyone who's registered will receive a recording of the webinar and the slides from the presenters, and you will most likely receive those tomorrow. The way that this will work, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I will stop periodically for the presenters and let them know if there is anything that is pending, or we will have time at the end for questions at the end of the hour. Before we begin, I want to thank our corporate sponsors, Horace Mann, Jostens, and MCM Fundraising. All three of those are so important to CAS because they help us to present great programming to administrators and building leaders around the state. So this morning, Dr. Mel Collier-Meek is an associate professor of school psychology at Teachers College, Columbia University. She and Dr. Lisa Sinetti, who could not make it today, but who works very closely with Mel and Alex, are co-founders of the Sustain Collaborative, licensed psychologists and BCBAs. And they work with Dr. Alex Pierce, assistant research professor at UConn, to conduct applied research to support school teachers' delivery of behavior support plans. Together, they have published extensively, received over $5 million in grant funding for applied school-based implementation research, and they collaborate regularly with Connecticut and New York City schools to support their MTSS implementation. And we at CAS value their partnership because they are always willing to step up and help us out with anything that is a challenge or a hot topic for our administrators. So without further ado, I hand it over to Alex and Mel.
Wow, thank you so much for that thoughtful introduction. And thank you so much to the folks who have joined us to talk about making MTSS happen. Like Tiffany said, this is a continual challenge. This is the work. And so we're going to orient and hope that you'll leave with some real practical strategies. Like she mentioned, Dr. Sinetti and I run the Sustain Collaborative, where we share resources about implementation and school-based practice. So please, if there are some resources particularly targeted towards school administrators and how we think they can kind of support implementation, so feel free to check those out. Our presentation today will be on MTSS in particular. We're going to review the foundations, which will be a breeze for some, but new to others. And then we're going to really focus in on some strategies for making it happen at the secondary level, with some focus on teaming, applying your energy really strategically, making adjustments, supporting your educators, and using data systems. And throughout, we're going to, as we get through each chunk, we're going to stop and reflect on key takeaways. I'm going to ask that you write down, here's what I learned from this part, and here's what I'm going to do, right? So you have that real bite-sized chunk and that action item that you can bring to your school and practice. So MTSS, as many of you know, is a kind of tiered system or tiered framework for supporting students. And when we are talking about MTSS, this is the umbrella term for other things that you might have heard, like RTI or SRBI on the academic side, or PBIS on the behavioral side. MTSS is the broad framework and the big idea that we are going to focus on high quality prevention for all students. So we're going to really invest in what Tier 1 looks like and provide and adjust our Tier 1 practices based on data. We are also going to make sure that we're highly responsive when challenges arise, or even if it seems like they might, like a student kind of demonstrating some initial risk, or we're seeing a challenge across the setting. And we're going to try to be systematic. So we're going to not just kind of attend to individual students, but we're going to try to look at the school as a whole and say, wow, we're seeing some issues with depression percolating, or we're seeing some issues with attendance percolating. How can we how can we adjust our system to better support our students rather than us kind of chasing after individuals. So as you reflect on these big ideas, remember that MTSS isn't just kind of something you do and get that check mark and you're done. Rather, the process of adjusting your high quality supports for all students or the responsive supports that you provide when groups of students are having challenges, and the kind of systematic process of pushing those two former pieces, that is a part of MTSS, and that's the continual work. So I want to highlight that if you feel like you're in the messy middle, you're not alone. That MTSS implementation isn't a one and done. You're not going to be done by the end of the year. If you're done, if feeling good now, as your students change, as challenges arise, it will look different in a few years. So I really want you to embrace and not be scared of the messiness middle, but rather look to it as the work of MTSS and school practice. So what is your to-do list while we're in that messy middle? Your to-do list is really what we're focused on here together. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Pierce to walk us through kind of the first piece in this to-do list, which is to work as a team.
Great. Thank you, Mel. So first, let's focus on how you can lead your teams to be as effective as possible. So, here we have a resource that is available for you to look more closely at on Sustain Collaborative on our website. But here I'll give an overview. So to run an effective team meeting, it can be really important for us to start by establishing a really clear meeting structure, including an agenda that you can develop in advance to guide your meeting, having consistent meeting logistics like the time and the place, and assigned meeting roles and responsibilities. These are structures that you can put in place proactively to make sure that you're making the most of the time and resources that you have. Relatedly, it's also really important to be specific and thoughtful about the purpose and the goals of our meetings that we're holding. This helps our teams to really focus on specific key agenda items and make sure that they are accomplished. So, a couple of important considerations as we go through are just making sure that communication is open and that all participants are contributing. That way we have, all perspectives accounted for, and that we're using data to drive our decision making, which we'll talk a little bit more in the coming slides. Okay. So teams are really vital to the success of MTSS. So it's an important initiative that you really can't be driving all by yourself as an administrator. You need a team behind you to make it work. Given the systems level nature of MTSS, putting together a team helps to make sure that the responsibilities are divided and distributed to individuals that have the appropriate skills and expertise. So there are some 4 key considerations that you can be making. So who is appropriate to serve as a team member, what team responsibilities include, what a team structure can look like, and then which data could be used to guide your decision making. So we'll talk about those in turn. This is a resource here that we would recommend and just sort of ask that you consider using an assessment tool like this or one similar to evaluate your tiered system, including your team composition. So here for the school-wide PBIS tiered fidelity inventory, it's broken down into 3 different tiers. And it specifically includes items related to teaming, like team composition and operating procedures that you might find useful to guide your MTSS team problem-solving process. So what does it look like to build a team with the appropriate skills and expertise? Well, we would recommend, and is recommended in the tiered fidelity inventory, that you include individuals that have expertise in certain areas. So behavioral, academic, database decision-making expertise, as well as a deep understanding of the school as a whole, and knowledge of the school operations. So this might include a school psychologist, a school social worker, a BCBA, a special education teacher or grade level lead teacher, and an administrator. So you may be a component of a larger team, but you may need additional expertise here. And within team meetings, there are a number of different roles that could be filled that are shown here on the right-hand side. So in addition to individuals with specific expertise, consider who can be added to your team that has the necessary skills to fill these different roles, including a family member or a community leader, and particularly at the secondary level, including students in your teams. So it's also important to consider the different responsibilities that need to be fulfilled by your team across different levels. So including identifying eligible students for tiers 2 and 3, monitoring the current tier 2 to 3 system, and students who are currently in tier 2 and 3. So when identifying students, schools should have a system in place for reviewing relevant data that can then be used to identify students who are in need of additional supports and determining which supports are most appropriate for these individual students. For current students, that means having a system for reviewing data on student outcomes as well as fidelity of implementation. Evaluating both of these is really crucial for making database decisions about next steps. And then lastly, at the systems level, the team should really be considering current tier 2 and 3 utilization and using that to determine whether process improvements might need to be made to tier 1. Okay, so then thinking a little bit about team structures. Structures can be put in place proactively to ensure that your MTSS team runs really smoothly. So as administrators, you can engage in some logistical planning to ensure that your team meets regularly, has a consistent structure and agenda, that it uses data to guide all of the decision making, and that there is a process in place to document and share meeting minutes and action items. So on the next slide, there we go, we have an example of a simple yet effective action planning template that you could use within your teams. So action plans should really include the what, who, and by when. So that is what task needs to be completed, who's responsible for completing it, the deadline for task completion, and then some other components that you may include are the date that it was assigned and its kind of current status. So for example, it's not started, it's in progress, or it's completed. This helps to guide those meetings and agenda items for different meetings.
And I just want to highlight, this seems very maybe tedious or simple, but we really want to, we have all been in meetings where lots is discussed and then the follow through looks really different. And so we're emphasizing simple steps like this because they are things that you can easily add to your meetings and that will make them much more effective and impactful when you look at your school as a whole.
Great. So then lastly, we want to talk about obviously using data in your meetings to guide a few things. So reviewing students who may be eligible to participate in tier 2 or 3, monitoring students who are currently in tier 2 and 3, and then really looking at the fidelity data to determine whether your tier 2 and tier 3 interventions are being used with fidelity. And whether we can really sort of trust in the student outcomes that we're seeing from in our data that was presented. So on the first slide, we had an example of what sort of maybe the systems level data look like. And on that second slide, we can look a little bit more at the data that might be used to monitor the students' progress within tier 2 and 3. So a couple of key takeaways here, and obviously I would encourage, as Mel said at the beginning, you to write down your own and really be thinking about what your takeaways are for your school. But a few things I would highlight are that establishing a team with the appropriate skills and expertise is an important first step to effective MTSS. It's also really crucial for you to put in place team meeting structures and processes to guide database decision-making, including having an established meeting structure and conducting regular data review. Okay. So once your effective MTSS team is in place, then you can turn your focus to kind of identifying MTSS as your primary initiative. So this can often mean getting rid of other practices that are less effective or not needed in your school. So we know that in schools, there are often too many initiatives to handle at once. And so we'll talk through a little bit about kind of how we can problem solve that. So while enthusiasm for new initiatives and programs is great and exciting, constantly adding new initiatives on top of others can really lead to this overload and eventually burnout. And we want to kind of avoid getting to that point. So let's talk a little bit about how we can do that. So first, we would really recommend starting by mapping out existing practices and resources that you have at your disposal. This will help you to identify what initiatives are actually truly feasible at your school, as well as how existing resources can be maybe reallocated to better suit your needs. So to do that, we'll kind of ask yourself these guiding questions. So what's going well at your school? And how can we, allocate resources to make these practices happen more consistently? Maybe what's not going as well, and maybe what can we drop? Maybe what practices are duplicative in our schools? And then what are the few practices that we absolutely need to have in place? And so we can do that by, one way of starting this is certainly not the only way, is to take an inventory of your existing practices. So following through with this example, you would list out the different practices that you use, what student need is being addressed, whether it's evidence-based, and then what criteria might be used for student entry into and exit from that program, and then what data are used to monitor both student progress and fidelity of implementation. So again, this might seem like a little bit of a tedious exercise, but it can be really helpful in identifying current practices that are not effective and maybe could be eliminated in favor of other practices. So once you've identified those practices that are not effective, you can start the process of de-implementation. And this really means removing practices that are ineffective just to make more space and have more resources for implementing practices that may be more impactful on student outcomes. And one thing here that I just like in this visual to highlight is this doesn't mean it's a failure. This means that you're using your resources, as efficiently and effectively as possible to choose things that maybe could be more effective than a practice that was already in place. So some key takeaways here are that while we are enthusiastic about promising new practices, having too many initiatives at once can lead to that overload and burnout. So instead, taking an inventory of current practices and eliminating those that are least effective or require too many resources to be done well can really help us to make space for better and more effective initiatives, including our MTSS.
Yeah, thank you. This kind of resource mapping is a great summer and spring project as you prep for the upcoming year. It's also a great kind of checkpoint before you adopt and bring something new in place. And so again, I think you will find, and we have found when we've worked in different schools that, at one school, they might have 7 interventions or 7 people working on a similar problem and nothing for another problem. And so really helps us to be thoughtful in reallocating responsibility and focus so that we can effectively serve the students and the challenges that they're presenting with. So the next piece that we'll talk about is logistics. And I don't need to tell this group that logistics in secondary schools are complicated. Let me validate that the challenges that you're having putting MTSS in place are real, and it is more challenging than the elementary school where students typically have one teacher that they work with. Schedules, course loads, credits, this all creates a really challenging way to be responsive to your data or responsive to the needs of your students in a flexible way. So absolutely, your challenge is validated. And so let's talk and look through some ways that we've seen other secondary schools manage these challenges to kind of implement MTSS nonetheless. One of the first pieces that I'll highlight, and that sometimes gets skipped over when we're thinking about MTSS, is the foundation is core instruction, right? Is using data to say, wow, 40% of our students are struggling with this topic. Let's feed that back to their core instructors so that we can give them more time to practice within their typical classroom. And that is actually going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, focusing on tier 1 academic and behavioral practices, spending time in advisory, focusing on reviewing behavior expectations, giving feedback to math and English teachers about where you're seeing students struggle. That is a critical part of MTSS. And so I really want to highlight that you can use your data to match students to intervention, but a huge part of what you can do also is use your data to bolster and improve tier 1. So again, that can look like class-wide behavioral or social emotional intervention. That can look like supporting your academic classes to include more kind of class-wide instruction and practice, fluency practice, and the like. So really use the classes that you have and embed and support the teachers to deliver class-wide intervention. Some other recommendations that I want to highlight are looking at that master schedule. Again, this might be locked in for this year, but I really highly recommend maybe at the district level with your other secondary schools, really looking at the master schedule and asking yourself how it does or doesn't set you up for success. Look to see if you can find that dedicated period of time that can kind of be a flexible period that can find schools' delivery of intervention or enrichment. Or if you have kind of 1 or 2 longer blocks, how you can use those longer blocks to kind of provide targeted instruction. I'm going to pop in the chat in a few minutes a great resource that has in an appendix different sample schedules that for secondary school settings that maps out a master schedule, but I just want to highlight a few pieces from that example. So you can see that the first school that we have here as an example broke apart lunch into 2 halves and kind of created a tier 2 support instruction during that time. Another school built this kind of power hour time and kind of used that time differently for the students to provide kind of extra practice. And for students that were kind of maybe not needing additional support, used it as an enrichment or kind of advanced kind of session for students. And they had a really effective, used that time really effectively and saw really strong outcomes. Another example is kind of using that longer period of time. If you have a consistent long period, then helping teachers to think about that period within a series of blocks and having a chunk of it for direct instruction, that core instruction that we're really working to enhance, but also having that kind of targeted time for smaller group activity focused on what the students need and kind of having them that period being really responsive to how the students are doing. Beyond kind of schedules, you want to think about the people, right? Who can provide additional interventions? And I want to encourage you that I think, particularly at the secondary level, people identify with their subject matter expertise, but I want you to encourage your educators and colleagues to really think beyond kind of their maybe initial training, to think about their role, and for you to think about as an MTS team, how can we support educators to be effective, right? So the gym teacher or the math teacher, the science teacher might not feel initially comfortable. How can we help them bridge that divide so that they can be more effective? Just as an example, I want to highlight 2 secondary interventions: the REP program, the Resilience Education Program. This is a free intervention available for students struggling with depression and anxiety. And it's a tier 2 intervention that can be delivered by paraprofessionals. So instead of needing to go to guidance counselors or school psychologists, this is something that's so clearly manualized that paras can kind of take that on. Another question or another example is this Merrill Strong Teens, which is developed in a kind of scripted program for social emotional concerns. And this can be delivered class-wide by advisory teachers or homeroom teachers. Again, it's very clearly scripted. And so I would encourage, in a faculty meeting, discussing what this looks like and helping people to get prepared, but really kind of expecting that folks could kind of make this happen. I see a great question in the chat that I want to respond to about the tiered time and is there a sufficient kind of a minimum amount of time? An hour? Is 20 minutes sufficient? This is a great question. I'm going to say it depends. First of all, if you can create any time, that's better than no time. So if 20 minutes is what you can do this year, let's go for it. It's really important that that time is used effectively, right? So that the students are getting what they need. And that targeted nature will be more important than having an hour that is kind of random. So I was working with some schools who had an hour, but it was just kind of a random homework help time. That's going to be less effective than 20 minutes that is targeted to the students' needs based on kind of their academic or behavioral performance. And then unfortunately, I'm going to say you're going to use the data to tell you if that's sufficient, right? So if you see modest improvements, but you don't see a big change, that might tell you that you need to spend more time with it, or that the interventions are different. So use your data and that messy middle part to kind of give yourself more information about that time. So I want to reflect on the key takeaways for this section. The first is to validate that this is really hard. The second is to kind of look to other schools and examples of how they've made it work. You guys are all in silos in your different schools, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel around how to make this happen. So I'll pop in the chat in just a second a resource that has a bunch of great schedules, and I want you to think flexibly within the constraints, and remember that small improvements matter. And so don't get disheartened that you can't do an hour for all kids right away. So look to what you can make happen. All right.
Okay. So next, let's talk a little bit about how best to support your educators when implementing MTSS. So we know that when effective practices are fully implemented, students can achieve better results and achieve those results more quickly. So let's take this example and take it outside of the context of schools for a minute, and then we'll put it back into the context of schools. So let's say that you're looking to build strength. So you decide that you're going to, do exercise 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for your plan. So you get working on that and you see some improvements, and you are able to build that strength. But let's say instead, if you do it just 2 days a week, you'll notice some improvements, but they probably won't be as big. But what if you go and instead of 5 days, or you do it 5 days a week, but instead for only 15 minutes? Again, maybe you'll see some improvements, but maybe not quite as much as you would have. had you gone for that sort of full 30-minute time. So now we can apply the same exact concept with other things. We can think about reading, writing, math, social emotional learning, behavior intervention, right? So this is true across the board for different types of intervention. We also know that most educators, like most of us, really have difficulty integrating new practices into their existing routines. So when we think about this as it applies to MTSS, right? New interventions and new initiatives are challenging things to incorporate, especially in the midst of other practices. So, we want to think about our teachers implementing with fidelity. And what does that mean? That means delivering all the different components of that MTSS practice in a way that is responsive to the student's needs, enthusiastic, positive, and for the full recommended time, right? If we're thinking back to our example, we want to do the full recommended time. So practices may not have as much impact if fewer components are delivered, if the delivery isn't sort of positive and smooth and natural, or if it doesn't occur for that full amount of time, we may not see the student gains that we'd like to see. And unfortunately, we also know that even with good training, educators' fidelity can drop within as little as 10 days from that initial training. So what is your role in terms of thinking about fidelity and supporting your teachers? So your role really is knowing, having knowledge about MTSS, being that expert, supporting your staff in using MTSS, and showing your staff that you're really invested in MTSS in your school. So breaking that down a little bit further, there's a lot of different support that you can provide to your teachers for these new MTSS practices. And one of those is just providing ongoing training and coaching to teachers throughout their implementation, right? We know that implementation can drop in as little as 10 days. Providing training in an ongoing way can help prevent that from happening. We would also encourage you to encourage your teachers to make adjustments to intervention plans, keeping the general core components of those interventions in place, but making things more feasible within their classroom setting, because we know when interventions fit within a setting, they're more likely to happen, right? They're more likely to happen with fidelity. So if we can make adjustments that make them fit better within the setting, all the better. We would also encourage you to support your teachers in gaining any materials and skills that they need to implement an intervention. So not just material resources, but also training and initial skills in how to do an intervention. And then lastly, it can be really helpful for teachers to understand the rationale for an intervention. So helping teachers to have more knowledge in why MTSS is important and what it does for their students, right? That can really help with buy-in to the intervention. So we have a few helpful resources on Sustained Collaborative that I would recommend that you can take a look at sort of around training. Here we have two on how to provide high quality training, as well as sort of these like myths and truths about training that I would recommend. And then we also have a little bit more information on how to provide coaching and support that is unique to the individual teacher, because we also know that just like our students who need individualized support, our teachers need individualized support as well. So moving away from that kind of one size fits all support for our teachers. Okay, so a few key takeaways from this section are that training and supporting your staff is really important. It can be so easy to assume that, when new MTSS practices are handed off to teachers, that they're going to go and they're going to implement them very well. And fortunately, we actually know that's really not the case without that kind of ongoing support. So providing high quality support and training, including coaching, access to relevant materials, helping teachers adapt practices to fit in their setting, and can all promote implementation and sustained use of a practice over time.
Great. I think I really appreciate that focus on making things happen, providing support as we're asking educators to shift their practices, to embed behavioral support in their, their academic instruction, or to be, looking at data in a different way. Like, these are new skills, and we need to think about the process of supporting and maintaining those skills across time, just like those action items that we talked about earlier, really delineating those action items, this ongoing support. It's not kind of the most zazzy or exciting part of our job, but it really takes us from having a great idea to making a difference in our school practice. The next piece I want to talk about is reviewing data, because you've heard us talk continually about how MTSS, again, isn't a checklist about kind of putting certain practices in place, but rather you looking at your school's data and figuring out what your school needs as a whole. So what do we need? Oh, we need more time with reading instruction. Oh, we need more time with math fluency, or we need more time with some social emotional learning. And then what are the things that are popping up? Where are the challenges? Are there attendance issues? Are there behavioral issues that we can look at? And you're going to get this information from data. And really, this is the long-term process, like I talked about, right? MTSS, not that checklist, but that ongoing messy middle process we're reflecting. And so I want to just highlight this Plan, Do, Study, Act, or this PDSA cycle that we see kind of in fields across different topics. But we really, can be kind of a checklist or a framework for using with our teams or with our kind of fellow administrators to really break down, like, what are we going to do? What are we thinking we need to do differently? Let's try it. Let's evaluate and just look at how it worked. And then let's plan for the next step. And again, I think breaking it out into these chunked activities really makes sure that we don't just stop at plan, or that we just go to do without kind of creating a plan. So really want to make sure that when you're doing and making change, that you've picked something bite-sized and that you're going through this PDSA cycle so that you can really say, like, did it work? Oh, we know it worked. Or you know what? It didn't work. So we're going to take it off our plates, and really kind of creating that planful process. And like I said, the messy middle is just this process over and over. It's you looking at data, trying something, evaluating, making the next plan. And so really be encouraged if you are engaging in this process systematically and things are still hard or confusing, like, that is the process, right? But you know what? The important piece here is you want to make sure that you use real data. So the kind of expectation of, like, I told the teachers to do it, I'm sure they did. Embed a social emotional lesson during their practice. Like, I'm sure they did. We know that people aren't always able to make things happen. In fact, it's kind of rare when people are able to take, an email and change it into action. So we need actual information about, like, did this happen? We also need actual student data. So we need to better understand, like, did this happen? What are the impacts in a really concrete way? I see there's a question about the recommended length of a time for a PDSA cycle. I think that really depends, and it's a really thoughtful question. I think these can happen pretty, it depends on the scope of what you're trying, what different looks like, right? So if different looks like training all of your staff to do something school-wide, like, that's going to take a while, right? That's going to be probably a several month, if not a year process. We can also look at smaller cycles. So we can say, let's train the behavior support specialist to use this new protocol, or let's work with this one teacher and try to use the new schedule in their class in advisory and then see if it works, and then we can scale up. That's something you could do over a couple of weeks. So it really depends on the scope of what kind of different is. Again, we are all so busy, and we talked about initiatives and burnout. So I'd encourage you to start small, right? Operationalize what you're going to do it, see how it works, and then kind of use that process to inform kind of future practice. Great question. So when we talk about systems for data, I think one of the most impactful things you can do school-wide, and again, we're always talking about tier 1 here, is build a data collection system that kind of gives us a sense of how students are doing, get a sense of how implementation is going, get a sense of how student outcomes are going. Now, you probably have some of these data systems, but they're likely kind of maybe challenging to access, or maybe there's that one person who knows the code. So figuring out a way to make your data more accessible and like usable is a really important thing that you can kind of spend time doing. Another area that you can kind of make a big impact as an administrator is setting a schedule for data review. Make it clear, like, I want every team to be looking at data at least once a month or twice a month, and sending me like a report of what that looks like. Now, know that you're going to have to do some teaching and supporting of educators so that they can be effectively reviewing data, right? That's a new skill for some of them. And so we're going to need to provide support for how to do that. But then you're also setting that expectation. The data system is more accessible. Here's the schedule. Here's the support. Now we want this kind of done on a regular basis. So as far as that kind of student outcome data side of things, we want to have a clear sense of, if we're doing smaller groups, what progress monitoring looks like, make sure we have a clear plan, make sure we have clear goals, and that those data are being entered and summarized. If you have math or reading specialists, this is a great place that you can really harness their expertise and have them do that at the kind of school-wide level, or at the kind of students at the tier 2 and tier 3. I think a universal screener, if you have that in place, is a great way to do that. At the secondary level, you very likely have, you have your state testing data that can be used as a general sense of how students school-wide are doing. You can also use grades as a general sense, like more students failing might kick in different things into gear. Again, that will be like that's a temperature thermometer. It's not super precise, but is a good sense overall. And yes, I do recommend a universal screener if that's possible for you to put in place. Using those data can be highly effective for understanding student outcomes. The one thing I'll say about universal screeners is try to keep the same screener for several years, right? So you can really compare those data, see how your efforts are making an impact. Sometimes they come out with the latest and greatest screener, and that's wonderful, but also kind of try to stick to one type so that you really have comparable information. On the fidelity side, remember, we talked about how fidelity is critical and maybe shouldn't just be assumed, right? So let's think about, if we have people delivering kind of tier 2 interventions, or we have teachers delivering class-wide interventions, how do we know that they happened? And so once we get to kind of more targeted interventions, we might have checklists about what they said. At the kind of tier 1 level, if we're kind of embedding class-wide interventions, we might just send a simple Google form and say, like, how long did you get a chance to do the social emotional lesson during advisory today? And see if that like specific guidance comes in. So take a look at that and get just a sense, a more kind of accurate sense of what is actually able to be happening in the classrooms. Again, I think as a school leader, you can really talk to your colleagues about, like, we're not trying to we want to know what's realistic, what is able to happen or not happen, and have those follow-up conversations so that people can feel comfortable being really honest about what they were able or not able to get done. when you bring together your student outcome data and your fidelity data, you can really make those database decisions about what is happening and what is next, and what needs to kind of happen. Do we need to support implementation, or do we need to move on or look at other issues? So again, I really think this framework for thinking about implementation and student outcome data as partners can be really important here. In general, we want to be thinking about how is our system, how is our school serving the needs of our students at tier 1 level? Like, oh, we have more students needing tier 2 and tier 3. Okay, what can we do about improving our tier 1 practices? How are individual students who might be receiving intervention, how are they doing? And then what does our implementation look like? And we're going to really ask ourselves these questions kind of together to understand what our next steps will be. Our key takeaways here are that we're going to use data to make continual decisions about our school improvement, that we're going to, a huge kind of way that we can help the schools that we are working with is by making data more accessible and like easy to interpret and understand, providing a schedule for when you expect data review to happen, and then kind of making training folks to do this new skill that is like database decision making. When we're thinking about data, we want to think about implementation as well as students and use those data broadly to ask about our systems. There's some great questions coming in, and I'm happy to talk about that. So I'm going to pop in the chat a list of universal screeners in a bit. And then we have a question about tier 1 practices. How do we find a balance between the PDSA and the 10-day fidelity window? So, okay, so when we think about folks' fidelity, so that we see a kind of a drop, this is if we just do like a brief initial training and then we don't kind of do follow-up discussions. If we have adapted the practice, provided the materials, delivered high quality training, and they know we're going to follow up on things, we can see longer term better implementation for most educators. And then we might have a smaller group of educators who require more extensive support across time. The key for thinking about that 10-day window is if we just tell someone what to do and then we don't check in, they're unlikely to keep doing something after 2 weeks, right? And that makes sense. Like if we think about the millions of initiatives or ideas that teachers are juggling, I mean, reasonably, they often can kind of struggle to figure out how to do things, which ones are important, which ones they can drop. So think planfully, help them know which pieces you really care about, give them the training, and let them know that you'll be checking in. And then I think you're going to likely see more improved fidelity and not kind of, for most people, struggle with that fidelity window. As far as the balance between the problem, the PDSA cycles, I would say that you are engaged in PDSA cycles all the time, whether you know it or not, right? So you are likely doing at least some of these pieces, right? Maybe you're trying out new things, but you're maybe not doing the data analysis, or you're not using that planfully to decide what's next. So again, if we're thinking about small chunks of areas for improvement, maybe before you start something new, it's just writing down the logistics and like the real plan and what the data source is going to be. Like look to how you can embed these cycles more planfully, because you are likely, as you change things, as you're trying to improve things, doing some components of these. So just look to bring some of these into your practice. I hope that's helpful and that I've addressed that question, but feel free to pop in further. Again, the big ideas here are that MTSS isn't a checklist. It's a process of using data to ensure that you're providing high quality supports for all, that you're being responsive when challenges arise, using that database decisions to adjust your school practice, and that you're being systematic. So looking at how can we do this, not just individually kind of trying to be responsive to individual students in crisis, but how can we look at the data and make plans to address student need more broadly. And again, the kind of to-do list that we talked about within this messy middle are things like get your team trained, on board, meeting regularly. That will like get several teams, a tier 1 team, a tier 2 team, a tier 3 team, have them work effectively, and your efforts will be multiplied. Focus on the main thing, get rid of the extras, help the educators in your building know what is important to you. Take things off, take redundancies off your plate. Think about de-implementation not as a failure, but as an area of growth. Manage logistics. Again, it's hard, and yet, so take a look at those scheduling examples that I sent out, talk to other teachers or elementary, try things out. Support educators. So think not just about student interventions, but how you're going to help implementers or educators to implement, right? Fewer things, but implemented well, you'll likely see better outcomes. And then review data, right? So the bedrock of all of this is data. So building your systems to make data more accessible and kind of you're able to use it more responsively will go a long way. I also want to highlight, I know we're speaking primarily to secondary school administrators right now, but if you in your district, or if you even in your school, if you have kind of a range of students in your middle school, if you have K-5 teachers who could use support in their classroom dealing with behavior issues, please reach out to get in touch. We're running a funded research project, and we'd love to work with folks in your school district. If you're interested in connecting in other ways, please reach out. I have my email address and our team email address here. And I want to highlight just some resources that you could check out, as well as a book about this like implementation more broadly. So with that, I think we're wrapped up and we're able to take more questions. And again, I will pop in my go-to resource for screeners.
Thank you, Mel. If there are any questions, you can add them. I'm monitoring the Q&A, and I think Mel's monitoring the chat, so you can put them in either place. And I just want to say, I think so spot on, because the analysis of resources and creating systems is so often underrated. I'm such a big systems person, but when you get rid of all of the extras, you really can focus on what you need to focus on and really identify what the system needs to be. So I don't see any questions, but if anybody has it on the way, you can reach out to Mel or Alex or I, and I can forward the emails. But remember, you're also going to receive the slides that the presenters used, as well as the recording, and you will probably get those tomorrow. So with that,
so do you recommend that tiered interventionists are part of the team of individuals reviewing data? This can be difficult in the scope of middle school and at the times they're doing intervention. That's a great question. So one thing that we've been thinking a lot about is like, what is the ideal timing of teams? Because a lot of times the people who we want on all of our teams are also the people that need to be out in the like doing the work. So I would say like, if you have a small but effective team, like feel welcome to have a smaller team and just work on the communication between the team and the others, right? So, others. So like maybe before you have a team meeting, you send a standard email that says like, do you have any agenda items for this team meeting? We're going to review the data and make some suggestions, and then we're going to reach out. So if you can't have people as a part of the team logistically, or even like, do you need 10 people in a room reviewing something, or do you just need 3 people who can work really effectively and then kind of collaborate? So I would say building that collaboration seems more important. Maybe you have a representative there. Maybe you share the agenda with them ahead of time so they can comment on it. But I think that, balancing that can be tricky, but I'm kind of on the side of smaller teams and more communication. We have another question on the STAR. It doesn't go low enough to catch secondary students struggling at word level. What other screeners do I recommend? I think I just sent in the kind of chat, there's a screener. What I like about this website, and again, poke around on this website, but I like that you can kind of search by and filter by kind of different areas. And I think that can be really helpful to identify specific screeners. If you want to follow up with us about your particular question, I can give you more specifics. Another question is around elementary schools have multiple programs that can be implemented with fidelity. Have you found success in any academic intervention programs that are suitable for the upper grades? Yeah, for sure. So I think a few things that I would think through with you is, one is we've seen a lot of success around academic, like vocabulary interventions, or behavioral interventions or math fluency interventions that are kind of like interventions that can be delivered class-wide for those types of issues. So I would say one is it doesn't always need to be a packaged intervention to be kind of an effective and evidence-based intervention. So as long as you're using your data to target the area of need and kind of using evidence-based practices as a framework for that work, you can kind of maybe be more flexible than a packaged intervention. I would also really heartily suggest checking out the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. They are a group out in Texas, and I'll pop them in the chat here, that do a lot around academic interventions for secondary students. And that might be, they have lots of resources and can kind of link to other academic related experts who might kind of provide concrete practices that you can bring into your schools.
Now there's another question.
Oh, okay. So math in your district. So a few things. So I would really suggest taking a look at what you see on the National Center for Intensive Interventions chart. I believe some FastBridge measures go up to 8th grade, and other kind of the Iowa assessments. They have math screeners that can go up to grade 12. So I would really take a look at what they have and what makes sense for your district. I think you can also look at your, as like a broad approach, taking a look at things like grades, or taking a look at students who failed the statewide testing as an indication of areas of need. So take a look at those kind of initial, or those available information. Sometimes we are so focused on collecting more data that we don't necessarily use what we have to just generally target need or identify students who are struggling. So I would really suggest taking a look at that. And thanks for the suggestion. That would also be. Thanks again for the opportunity to connect with you. Feel free to follow up. I really appreciate the opportunity for both of us to come to speak with you.
Thank you again for everything. And just a reminder to everyone who's on here, you will receive an email with the recording and the slides. And I'll also include the links to the resources that Mel has added into the chat. So those will probably be received tomorrow. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.